Hello and welcome to the Virtual CMO podcast. I'm your host, Eric Dickmann. Today, I'm excited to have guest Amanda Rabideau on the program. Amanda is the founder, CEO, and fractional CMO at the Arch Collective, a firm that handles marketing strategy and execution for tech startups. She believes that operating with talented freelance marketers is the future of work and a valuable advantage provided by fractional CMOs. Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
I love this. I love talking about fractional CMO work and people who have moved into this space. It's really where we're pivoting with this show a little bit to focus on how fractional CMOs can be of benefit to many businesses that are out there. And to kind of kick off that discussion, I would love it if you could just share a little bit of an expanded background. How did you work inside the corporate world before you decided to go off on your own and become a fractional CMO?
Sure, happy to share. So I'm one of the few people that started her career at a startup and then continued to work at bigger companies. And then after about 5 years at CoreLogic, which is the largest provider of data analytics for property, I decided to start looking to go back into the startup world. Living in San Francisco, obviously Silicon Valley, the heart and soul of startups in this country, or it was.
Yep.
Um, and while I was interviewing for multiple CMO roles at the same time, I sort of had this thought of, it's too bad I can't work for all of these companies at the same time. They're in a similar place. They have very, very similar problems. And, I could be really efficient at solving all of these at one time. And once I had that thought and made the comment to my partner, I was sort of like, why don't I just go out and do this? And that was the genesis of Arch Collective. And so I set out and did exactly that. So I now work with post Series A funded B2B tech startup companies to help them grow their business, serving as a fractional CMO.
I think that's really exciting. When you look back at your corporate career before doing that, what are some of the companies that you worked for? What kinds of corporations did you work for?
Well, I spent at that first startup that I mentioned. I was there for over 6 years before I went and got my MBA at UNC Keenan Flagler. Go Heels! And then after that, I worked in digital marketing consulting, and so I was working with companies like Microsoft and Dell and New Relic, so some startups too. PayPal was a client of ours. And then from there, I went and worked at CoreLogic, which I just mentioned, and I was there for several years leading innovation and then moving into a marketing leadership role, and then left to start Arch Collective. So while I spent, 5 years at CoreLogic, I did spend several years consulting with larger clients too, and much preferred the startup environment and the speed and the pace at which those companies move.
Was there a moment sort of in that early part of your career where you did something marketing wise that really had a significant impact and it just sort of turned on that light bulb to say, I really see the power of marketing and what marketing can do for a business?
Oh, that's a great question. And I have that moment.
Oh,
And
great.
so the company that I was working for, that startup, was an orthodontic startup. So we were selling orthodontic technology, and I'd been in sales actually for my first few years there, and looked to pivot out. And the CEO was basically like, you go figure out what your job is. I'd been number one in sales, so I had built up some credibility, and so I had to kind of figure out what my job was going to be. And I was meeting with some of the clinicians in the lab, which a lot of them were former dental assistants or orthodontic assistants and dentists from other countries. And as I started talking with them, I learned a little bit about the referral process and how dentists refer patients to orthodontists. And it was in those conversations that I developed a hypothesis that, wow, it's actually the hygienists that have more say over where the referrals go to
Ah,
orthodontists
interesting.
than the dentists themselves. Why aren't we doing anything to promote this among the dental hygienists? We're talking to dentists to promote them to to refer patients to orthodontists. And so, long story short, I ended up putting together this dental hygienist referral program that we kicked off in 4 markets across the country. we had, and I unfortunately don't remember the exact return or the number of the growth percentage, but the numbers were astounding. And the company still is using this program, or had been up until they were acquired a couple of years ago. And so it was a sticky program. And to me, like, why that really stuck out is that, it's marketing isn't entirely a science, but it's using a scientific process and then using some art to improve on your process. And that I had a hypothesis, we went out and tested it, and then we figured out ways to improve on the results using the art part of that whole art and science equation. And so that really got me interested in marketing.
I love that for a couple of reasons. I love the whole testing a hypothesis. I wish more people would do that in marketing. When you have scale, you can do a lot of A/B testing and see what works better, right? But for smaller businesses, sometimes that's really tough. And I also love that you focused on who your content is really needs to be focused on. What is your target buyer, or in this case, the target person to do that referral, right? I think a lot of people make assumptions there and never really test to see if that's true.
Yeah, and the other piece that I didn't really mention, but I think is so important, and it's really the foundation of how I look at marketing, is that because I did start off in sales, I was right there on the front lines with the customers every day. And then, the listening to those customers, hearing what they're saying, and then incorporating that into how we tell the story is something that I tell all of my clients. I use that on my clients, and I think it's such a crucial part, that voice of client, and making sure that you tell a story with your audience in mind. You don't need to tell the story you want to tell, you tell the story that they need to hear.
Yes. And that's tough, I suppose, especially working in the world of startups, right? You have a lot of passionate founders
Mhm.
there. They believe they've got a great product. They have something that, the world is waiting for. How do you work with
Yep.
some of those tough clients and get them to focus more on what the audience wants to hear rather than the story they want to tell?
I think it starts by looking at the numbers, right? I
Mm.
mean, if ultimately their company is growing on the right trajectory, they're getting all the clients they want, they're meeting their numbers, I think it's a little bit harder to get them to do something different. But usually when I come in, it's, the Series A funding is closed. They've got to triple their revenue. They've exhausted their network and the low-hanging fruit in the industry, and they need to demonstrate that they can repeatedly acquire new customers. And so they may not know exactly like what the right message is. And so, saying, look, we're going to start by talking to those clients you have and uncovering how they're using it, what's valuable, like what are they really thinking about, how do they make their decisions. Usually once we've done that process and we've shared that information back, it's an easier sell on getting them to use that in the messaging, because they recognize, wow, this isn't the way that we've been talking about it, or this may not have been the way we've been thinking about it, or we may not even know this is how our product was being used.
It's really interesting. And, I also am curious about your story. You talked a little bit about what you were doing before you started the Arch Collective.
Mhm.
Once you decided to start it, sounds like you had a partner. What was that like? Was your early business referrals from previous clients, starting to work with some of those because of existing relationships that you had? Was it referrals from within your close network of people who, offered up business right away? What was that like starting out a new business?
Well, first, when I said partner, I was referring to my husband. So
Oh,
I
okay,
don't have
perfect.
any, I don't have a business partner, but good catch. And But really, it's, I was, I guess, tapping into my previous sales experience. I mentioned I started in sales at the startup, where I had to start letting people know that I was out there, providing fractional CMO services. And so, much like the startups that I work with, I had to drive brand awareness and let people know about what I was doing and the value prop that I offered. And fortunately, because of my experience, and especially my background and having worked at CoreLogic, I had a network of people that had left there to go work at startups in the property ecosystem. And so I was able to gain some traction that way. But now, it's kind of, and I always can't stand this phrase, but eating my own dog food, where a lot of
Sure.
the things that we're doing for our clients are the same things that I do to continue to grow my business and acquire new clients.
Being a guest on a podcast being one of them, right?
That's right. Well, and some of it's the basic blocking and tackling. We have to create content. We have to, promote through different campaigns, and, drive referral sources. Do some of the cold outreach, via LinkedIn and other things. So, it's sometimes it's not all rocket science, right? It's a matter of knowing, like having a plan and then executing on that plan, because the best plans, if they're not executed against, then they're not doing a whole lot of good.
No, that's exactly right. And I think it's very interesting too when I hear about people's stories and how they start out, because starting a business is one thing, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how it's going to go 1, 2, 5, 10 years into the process, right? Because
Hmm.
some of those early referrals or network connections, they dry up, and then you have to have that lead generation machine in
Yep.
place. Have you found that true with your business too, that it looks a little different today than it did when you first started out?
Well, certainly, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
more, I mean, hopefully, I'm taking what I've learned and improving on the business over time. Like again, a lot of my clients need to do, but yes, certainly what I was doing on November of 2019 is different than what I'm doing today. But with all that time and experience comes a refinement of my messaging, a refinement of my offering, and an expansion too, as well, because I've recognize where there's additional challenges amongst my target audience, and so being able to provide solutions to help them, with those up challenges that I recognize or see, or gaps in the marketplace. And I think that's what we're all doing, is business owners, is trying to fill a gap.
You mentioned target audience, and I think that's a really important discussion. We often tell clients that we want them to niche down, right? You can't go
Yep.
after too broad a swath of the marketplace. It's just too expensive. But as a small independent business owner, the challenge is we typically don't have the scale, right? We don't have the volume of leads coming in to really, on a scientific basis, say this is where the majority of our leads are coming from. So you have to make some choices. You have to decide where you want to go. Obviously, you had some history in tech and startups. And so that was your proposition going in. You're saying this was going to be the audience that I focused on from day one?
Well, and so I absolutely followed my advice on this one, because I talk to startup founders about niching down all the time for all the reasons you just listed. And I guess that's the advantage of talking to another CMO, right? You can
Right,
speak the same
exactly.
language. And so I'm extremely targeted in my audience and who I reach out to. It's because I've seen the upside of doing that, and I've also seen the downside of doing that, where it can get confusing to the marketplace. And if you're not very clear about who you're going after. In fact, I have a phrase that I call the FOMO of revenue when I'm talking about it with founders. And I totally get it. You need that revenue coming in. If you've got employees, you've got salaries to pay, you've got other bills, invoices, all of that. But you're doing yourself a disservice if you try and go too broad, especially at the beginning. And so I just decided to follow the advice I give, and so far it's worked out. So I guess I've got another proof point that niching down is effective.
No, that's great. That's encouraging, I think, to all the people that are out there that are trying to figure out if they should or not. When you kind of pitch your services to various companies, various startups, does the concept of a fractional CMO resonate with people? Do you have to explain what that is? It's a relatively new term, right? I think it started out in the CFO's office and then is gradually spreading through the C-suite. But as I often say on this show, unless you're a Fortune 500 company, chances are you don't even have a CMO, right? CMO tends to be kind of a Fortune 500 title, but it's a concept, right? It's somebody who's working
Mhm.
part-time for your business on behalf of your business for marketing or for finance or for operations or whatever the
Yep.
fractional title might be. How have you found the general acceptance of it or understanding of it?
Well, it's certainly the acceptance and the understanding of it has grown over these last few years, and I think you completely nailed it, Eric. It started off as really a lot of fractional CFOs, and so people were familiar with that concept. And in fact, when I started off doing this, I met with a few VCs, and they even said, they're like, "Oh, I'm familiar with a fractional CFO, but not ever a CMO." And they kind of wanted to wait and see, like, how does this work? I haven't done that with any of my portfolio companies yet. And frankly, it was actually a client of mine, Lucy Stribley from Flyreel, and she had said to me, she's like, "I think what you're doing is it's called a fractional CMO," and because I think I was still using interim CMO, and so she introduced me to that. This is towards the beginning of my time working at starting Arch Collective, but it was something I had to educate myself about. And it's something that a lot of people outside of tech startups aren't still familiar with. I kind of call it ask my dad, and if he understands, maybe it's a bit complicated. And a lot of my family hadn't heard that term, or even some friends of mine. But in the startup world, I think it's beginning to be more commonplace. And where a lot of the questions are, it's like, how does this work? Like, what happens when you leave? What really are you going to get done? And then, of course, what's different about a fractional CMO and me bringing in an agency? And so those are some of the questions that I still get about bringing on a fractional executive.
When somebody's looking for somebody to come in and fill a role like this, generally they don't know who you are, right? So there's always that element of trust building that has
Mhm.
to happen in order for an engagement to start. Do you find that with many clients, they like to start with a smaller, very purposeful engagement, maybe some sort of an audit or some sort of a project that they have, and then that gradually expands out to a full fractional CMO engagement? Or do you find a lot of your clients, that's what they want? They know that that's what they need. They need somebody to come in and build a strategy, and that's what they bring you in for from day one.
It's been a little bit of both,
Yeah,
frankly. And so, I have a lot of clients that are like, I know I need a CMO, whether it's they can't afford it, or like a full-time CMO, or they have something more specific in mind. I do have those that they're like, this is what I need. And frankly, part of my process is to make sure that this is what they need as well, because it doesn't benefit either parties if they don't need a fractional CMO. I go in there and then we're not aligned on what they need and what needs to be accomplished. I do work with some earlier stage companies, and they may say, "Oh, I found you. I'm interested in you as a fractional CMO." And I frankly just tell them, I don't think you need me right now. Like,
yeah.
when you're really early stage, you need to just, it's a little bit of throwing things against the wall and seeing what stick, and building things up and building up your client base, and making and mistakes as well as getting things right. And so your money's going into your product, it's going into your engineering team probably. And so having an executive in marketing, like, I probably wouldn't have enough to do. So in those cases, I might, start with a smaller project, and then that relationship could last. And then, a little while later, it makes sense for me to come in as a fractional CMO. But it's kind of like a 50-50. It just depends. But I really, I have a pretty um, rigorous vetting process myself, because I want to make sure that it's the right fit for my process and what I do with my playbook and how I help the companies, and that they're at the right place for me to come in and help them.
I think that's so important what you said, because especially when you're a smaller business, right? Leads are gold, right? Leads are so important.
Yep.
But sometimes you've got to do the right thing, and you've got to say, hey, I'm not what you need right now. You maybe just need a freelancer to, create a logo or something. Or maybe you need a full service
Totally.
agency because you just want to go through and create a whole bunch of stuff all at once. And it's finding the right place to enter a company, because it's to everybody's benefit if it can be a valuable engagement from day one.
Couldn't agree more. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
Well, you talked a little bit about your process. And so over time, I'm sure you've developed and refined that process. At a high level, can you share sort of some of the things that you do as part of that process, or some of the deliverables from it?
Happy to. Well, the first thing I do when I start with a fractional CMO client is put together a marketing plan. It's the proverbial, if you're driving cross country, you don't just get in your car and hope that you arrive in the right location, right? You need to have a plan for how to get there. And plus, to me, it starts to build that relationship. And going back to your comment about you need to build trust, where when I put that plan together and I'm sharing the process and taking them through, like, this is why the plan is the way it is, and here's what went into it, and what did I get out of the voice of client, and all the different pieces that go into it, it does start to build that relationship. Then once the plan's done, it aligns both myself and typically the CEO and the board, if they've got involved in approving it, to say, okay, this is what I'm going to be accomplishing over the next 6, 12 months, or whatever the time frame may be. And then it makes it, and I'll say easier in air quotes, I got to figure out which way I got to go, easier in air quotes, um, for me to go ahead and do my job. Because one of the reasons that CEOs typically want a fractional CMO and not a lower level marketer is because of the autonomy, the ability to get things done, to make decisions, and to take things off of his or her plate as a CEO. And so once that plan's been approved, the same way I would as a CMO of another company, I'd be executing against it, reporting back on the results, tracking on the budget, all of the things necessary to get that done. And typically in those first few months, what a startup company needs at post Series A, they need a refresh on, or for the first time, a proper messaging framework. So getting really clear on the story. We need to start building out a content library that aligns to the buyer's journey. There probably needs to be some updates to their digital properties, maybe a entire, overhaul, but oftentimes we can just update those digital properties, and then to start thinking about building out a full-time team. And so those are typically some of those first things that I'm doing when I'm coming in. And so I like to say I like to get that foundation set that we can then build and grow from there.
I love the way you put the focus on the plan and the strategy, because I don't know about you, but what I've seen with so many businesses is that they're just randomly doing things that aren't really connected to a program or to a
Yep.
strategy. And let's face it, marketing is a cost center, right? Marketing is an expense, and it can
Mhm.
add up very quickly, especially if you're buying advertising or doing something like that. And if you don't really know what you're trying to accomplish or how to measure it, or how all your various marketing objectives are tied together, you can waste a lot of money quickly and be pretty disappointed with the results.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, and in that strategy, there's an opportunity to educate the other executives. So sure, there's some founders that they have some marketing background, or they understand it, or this isn't their first startup, so they get it. A lot of times the CEO could have been an engineering, an engineer, have an engineering background, or something that isn't necessarily aligned with marketing. So there can be some education in letting them know, hey, this is why this is going to work, and this is why what you have been doing, the proverbial, throwing against the wall, seeing what sticks, why it wasn't effective. It doesn't mean marketing isn't effective. It just may mean that those tactics you were using weren't the right ones, whether it be the message that was included, or the channel that you were using, or you were trying to go after this audience and that's not where they are. All sorts of different things. So I try and do some education too, because we can't assume that everyone knows marketing like we know marketing.
Well, and that sort of is a great segue to a question about, what do people ask when they engage with you? Is it
Hmm.
that we're at the stage of growth now where we know we need marketing? We don't have any in place right now, so we really need a plan. Is it we've been doing some marketing, but it's not working? Uh, what is a typical sort of a pain point that somebody, calls you up on the phone, sends you an email and say, "Hey, I need help with blank."
Yeah. And it's such a great question, because I actually ask almost that exact question when I'm speaking with a potential client, which is, which one of these best describes you? Because if it's they've already like, hey, I just want a bunch of leads, then I'm probably not that person, or they might not be in the right stage. But where my clients typically are, it's kind of the, oh shit, we just got all this funding and we have no idea where these clients are coming from. Help.
Mhm.
And it's, or like, we don't have a lot of leads. And so, I'm really there to help them drive revenue and acquire new customers. That's typically what's needed at that post Series A. And so when they're asking me questions, it's around, these are my goals. This is the revenue target, or this competitor is eating my lunch. Like, how do I get out from behind that company and, you know, start chipping away at the marketplace? Because it seems like I'm losing against them in the pony dog, or not the dog and pony, the bake offs, I should say.
Right.
And so, there's a whole host of things that these companies need to do, but typically it comes down to client acquisition and driving awareness around the company. And, towards the, call it like the middle or the end of my engagement, when we're starting to think about that next round of fundraising, some of our focus does shift away, because hopefully at that point we've got a little bit of the marketing machine up and running and built out, where we're starting to see the outputs of the work we've done. And now it's time to say, okay, how do we start positioning the company in the minds of potential investors? And then that becomes a different exercise and a different end goal, which is to get the funding for the next round.
And do you sort of look at these companies and think that they have locked themselves into a particular strategy? What I mean by that is, do they say we need some sort of a fractional CMO? Do they say we need a full-time hire? Are they considering a full service agency? Have they sort of settled on one camp or the other, or in your experience has been they're looking at a wide variety of options?
I think that they're looking at a wide variety of options, which is
Yeah.
why I often get the like, well, what's different about you than
Yes.
an agency, or like, or why shouldn't I get a full-time CMO right now? And I think that that's part of that education. They're looking to understand, do I need you or not need you? And I don't want to work for a company that doesn't need me any more than they don't want to be, bringing someone on that they don't need as well. So I do really try and get into, the details and like have multiple meetings with these clients to make sure that we are on the same page with what is it that I'm going to come in and do, and how is that different than if you did bring in a full service agency, or if you did bring in someone full time, and everything in between and all the other options. So yeah, I think typically they're exploring and they're trying to understand what's best for their business to help them achieve their growth targets.
So, because we believe in marketing, we want to make sure we get a chance to do some of it here on this show today. So, if somebody's listening to this program and say, I'm considering getting a fractional CMO, what do you say is your ideal client uh, that should be knocking on your door and saying, hey, come check us out?
Well, I would say post Series A funding, or like you just closed your Series A, you're a B2B tech company. Where you're located doesn't matter to me. I don't think it, in today's world, I'm working with people all over the globe. So, location is pretty much inconsequential. And while I do have a deep background in prop tech or insure tech, meaning like property and casualty, P&C insurance, and the whole property ecosystem, I'm really open to clients that are also making an impact in a positive way on the climate and sustainability. And so, if you're a B2B post Series A funded tech company, reach out to me. Happy to have a conversation and see if it's a good fit and we're aligned on what you need and how I can help you.
That's perfect. I think that's a great description. Amanda, tell everybody where they can find out about more about you and more about the Arch Collective on the web.
Sure. So my website is arch-collective.com. And of course, I'm on all the social media channels as well. But you can find a lot of my content on LinkedIn. And then you can catch me doing some fun content and reels on Instagram as well at Arch Collective Marketing is where you can find me on Instagram. And then just search Arch Collective on LinkedIn and you'll find me there as well.
That's perfect. We'll make sure that we have all that linked up in the show notes so that people can find you. Amanda, this has been a great discussion. I love talking about the benefits of being a fractional CMO and how they can really benefit businesses out there. So glad you could come on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Eric. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.